So thank you for coming, everybody, and thank you for having me to the Tolkien Society. My project today draws from intersectional feminist and postmodern queer theories to examine queerness in the works of Tolkien. Recent years have seen an increase in scholarship discussing this topic, often focusing on homosexuality and homoamory in the Lord of the Rings books, movies, and fandom. While I draw on that scholarship, when I talk about queerness, I do not specifically mean same gender, sex, or romance, although those are, of course, included. Rather, Eve Sedgwick has discussed the fact that one of the things that queer can refer to is the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances, resonances, lapses, and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. That mesh is what I mean to explore. I will examine Tolkien's depictions of characters, relationships, ways of loving, and ways of existing that challenge contemporary cis-hetero amatonormative structures and assumptions. To clarify some terminology, by cis-hetero, I refer to the combination of compulsory heterosexuality, which excludes queer orientations, and compulsory cisgenderism. That is, the idea that everyone's gender must align with their biological assigned sex. By amatonormativity, I mean the assumptions that a central exclusive amorous relationship is normal for humans in that it is a universally shared goal, and that such a relationship is normative in that it should be aimed at in preference to other relationship types. Now, Alexander Doty notes that it is arrogant to insist that all non-blatantly queer-coded characters must be read as straight, especially in cases where all we have is narrative silence on the subject of certain characters' sexuality. Certainly, there is no explicit homosexuality in Tolkien, but there is not a great deal of explicit heterosexuality either. Rather, we see example after example of characters who form non-heterosexual partnerships, transcend traditional gender categorization, and develop non-normative families that, while not necessarily homosexual, are deeply queer. Both Bilbo and Frodo disrupt the cis-heteronormative culture of the Shire. The houses and holes of Shire hobbits were often large, inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional. In Unfinished Tales, Gandalf also notes that Bilbo had never married. I guess he wanted to remain unattached for some reason deep down which he did not understand himself or would not acknowledge, for it alarmed him. Bilbo further disrupts the order by adopting an heir. The opening pages of Fellowship are devoted to a discussion in the local pub about Bilbo's adoption of Frodo, whether or not Frodo is a real Baggins, and how it must have been a nasty shock for those Sackville Bagginses, Bilbo's would-be biological heirs. And ultimately, this disruption is positive because Bilbo's non-normative, adoptive, non-biologically reproductive family of bachelors is the only reason the ring is destroyed. And of course, the ring is carried to Mount Doom by two male hobbits whose relationship is deeply intimate, both emotionally and physically. When Sam rescues Frodo, naked and tortured by orcs, Frodo lies back in Sam's gentle arms, closing his eyes. Sam felt he could sit like that in endless happiness. Later, as they rest on their approach to Mount Doom, Sam groped for Frodo's hand. It was cold and trembling, and lying down, he tried to comfort Frodo with his arms and body. And as David Craig argues, the intimacy and love between Frodo and Sam is the moral and emotional heart of the story, which is capable of saving the world from evil. There are those who argue that this relationship is not queer because it represents close male bonds formed during World War I. But that reading ignores the fact that those close male bonds were frequently very queer. Some did involve sex, and others involved emotional and physical intimacy that, while non-genital, would defy contemporary understandings of heteronormativity. To discuss intense same-sex relations during war, we must introduce a different and less distinctly sexualized array of emotional intensities and bodily sensations, a continuum of non-genital tactile tenderness that goes beyond strict gender divisions, sexual binaries, or identity politics. And after the quest, this intimacy doesn't end, but evolves to include Rose Cotton. Sam and Rose move in with Frodo when they get married, and together the two of them settle to name their first child Frodo. When they decide against that name because the baby is a girl, Frodo is the one who names her, specifically choosing a flower name like Rose. Frodo makes them his heirs and chooses the names for their next 4 children as well. There's nothing heteronormative about this arrangement, this family. Ultimately, Frodo cannot remain in the Shire and Sam does not feel that he can leave yet. But we learn in the appendices that he eventually does. When it comes to the end of his story, Sam's love and desire for Frodo persist. I don't mean to subordinate Sam's love for Rose and the family that they build together, but rather to demonstrate that this relationship between Frodo and Sam and all 3 of them, whether or not it includes sex, transcends any concept of compulsory hetero-amatonormativity. This type of non-normative partnership appears repeatedly. Beleg's unfailing devotion to Turin, Maedhros and Maglor, brothers raising foundling children, Beorn with his family of animal companions. The list goes on. Perhaps the most obvious other example is Legolas and Gimli. Compulsory amatonormativity puts forth the idea that people are either just friends or more than friends. But the relationship between Legolas and Gimli challenges the notion that friendship is subordinate to romantic love and that a life partner must be a sexual and romantic partner. Appendix A specifies the great love that grew between Gimli and Legolas, and that it is said that Legolas took Gimli, Glow-in-Sun, with him across the sea because of their great friendship, greater than any that has been between elf and dwarf. If this is true, then it is strange indeed that a dwarf should be willing to leave Middle-earth for any love, or that the Eldar should receive him. Of course, the appendix also states that it is said that Gimli went also out of desire to see again the beauty of Galadriel, which offers a more heteronormative explanation. But no admiration of a lady's beauty can negate the queerness of this partnership. We do not see between Legolas and Gimli the physical tenderness that exists between Frodo and Sam, but we do see them elevate friendship to the level usually reserved for romance, lifelong partnership and mutual commitment, which stretches beyond the edges of the world and into immortality. This type of relationship dismantles compulsory hetero-amatonormativity by simply bypassing it and presenting a different model of family. Queerness does not always take the form of wholesome families and partnerships, however. It often seems that characters who do not desire marriage and or sex, even though they might, such as Boromir and Frodo, have something wrong with them. And there is one character in particular whose non-normative relationships are especially destructive. Like Frodo and so many others, Sauron enters into intense relationships with other male characters. Unlike them, he is such a powerful character that his actions and relationships are destabilizing, not just thematically or for a small society like the Shire, but for Middle-earth at large. In the beginning of Arda, Melkor seduced Sauron to his allegiance, and he became the greatest and most trusted of the servants of the enemy, and the most perilous, for he could assume many forms, and for long, if he willed, he could still appear noble and beautiful. Sauron is thus seduced away from the good Valar and comes to serve Melkor, whom he adores, with obsessive devotion even after Melkor's overthrow. In The Return of the King, Gandalf says, "Other evils there are that may come, for Sauron is himself but a servant or emissary," implying that Sauron continues to act as a servant of Melkor more than 6,000 years after Melkor's defeat. Sauron is led away from his original and correct allegiances to the Valar and Ilúvatar. Whether or not this adoration is erotic, this rhetoric of loving the wrong person in defiance of God is a deeply queer one, especially because of where it leads. In the Second Age, Sauron becomes a clear example of the archetypal queer villain. He demonstrates a pattern of taking on a fair body and seducing powerful male figures to achieve his ends. I would argue that the relationships Sauron pursues with both Celebrimbor and Ar-Pharazôn are openly coded as homoerotic. Sauron is able to seduce the elves of Eregion, including Celebrimbor, because of his ability to take on a fair form. His hue is still that of one both fair and wise. Together they forge the rings of power, which go on to destabilize the entire known world. When Celebrimbor learns the truth, he hides the rings and Sauron kills him. And in black anger, Sauron turned back to battle, and bearing as a banner Celebrimbor's body hung upon a pole shot through with orc arrows. This image of a male figure hung on a pole shot through with arrows is clear Saint Sebastian iconography. Saint Sebastian has been a recognized symbol of male homosexual desire for centuries, and with impassioned if veiled enthusiasm, late Victorian writers submitted to images of Saint Sebastian as a coded means of articulating same-sex desire. This coding of Saint Sebastian as a symbol of homoeroticism only grew in the following decades. So Celebrimbor is beguiled by a fair male figure with dangerous secrets and ends up on a pole shot through with arrows. Tolkien weaves careful references to various religions and mythologies throughout his entire legendarium. As a Catholic, he would recognize Saint Sebastian iconography. And as a distinguished scholar of the arts, he would likely understand the cultural significance thereof. Soon after, Sauron enters into a relationship with the human king Ar-Pharazôn. He again assumes a fair form and, well, seduces the king. Sauron humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn and smoothed his tongue. Ere 3 years had passed, he became the closest to the secret counsels of the king, for flattery sweet as honey was ever on his tongue. Then Ar-Pharazôn, being besotted, hearkened to Sauron, and he began to ponder in his heart how he might make war upon the Valar. Through these techniques, Sauron convinces the king to literally go to war against heaven, leading to the fall of the entire nation. Numenor went down into the sea with all its children and its wives and its maidens and its ladies. Specifically, it is the children, wives, and maidens who suffer from this queering of Numenorian aristocracy. Celebrimbor and Ar-Pharazôn are the most blatant examples, but there are others. From the end of the First Age throughout the Second Age, Sauron demonstrates this pattern of taking on a fair form and flattering a powerful male figure to achieve his goals, behavior that is distinctly queer-coded and can be read as feminizing. So these two oppositional representations of queerness must be read in balance. Sam's devotion to his master Frodo can be compared to Sauron's devotion to his master Melkor. Sam knew now where his place was and had been, at his master's side. Back he ran down the steps, down the path towards Frodo. Thus too, Sauron walked behind Melkor on the same ruinous path down into the void. These are both depictions of world-changing, undying, same-gender love and devotion. The Lord of the Rings ends with a trio of tidy marriages, but the driving force behind the main storylines, behind the actions of the villain and of the saviors, is this love that is not heterosexual or homosexual or anything that can be categorized so neatly. Tangential but related to ideas of sexuality are ideas of gender, which are also destabilized. This is evident in the very world, in the way that the different peoples of Middle-earth all demonstrate different models of gender. The dwarves have beards from the beginning of their lives, male and female alike, nor indeed can their womenkind be discerned by those of other race. Tolkien changed his mind several times about the creation of dwarf women. In one version, the dwarf genders are indistinguishable because the dwarves were not created by Ilúvatar, but by the Vala Aule, and Ilúvatar would not amend the work of Aule, and Aule had yet made only things of male form. Therefore, the women of the dwarves resemble their men more than all other races. So physical sexual characteristics appear fairly immaterial to gender for dwarves, and it would seem for Ilúvatar as well, because he didn't see the need to amend it. Similarly, there is less difference in strength and speed between elven men and elven women than is seen among mortals. When we first meet Galadriel and Celeborn, they are described in equivalent terms. Very tall they were, and the lady no less than the Lord, and they were grave and beautiful. They were clad wholly in white, and the hair of the lady was of deep gold, and the hair of the Lord Celeborn was of silver, long and bright. Male elves in general would often appear gender non-conforming by contemporary Western standards, with their long hair braided with gold, jewelry, beardless faces. We might call all dwarves masculine and all elves feminine, but even those terms cannot really be applied to these peoples who have fundamentally different experiences of gender and gender presentation. Further, Tolkien explicitly states that for elves, biological sex and gender identity are separate. Souls or spirits of the elves are of their nature male and female, and not their bodies only. By making it clear that gender lies not in the body, Tolkien breaks with gender essentialism and leaves open the possibility of transgender elves. I would argue that the phrasing male and female, not male or female, also allows the possibility of both non-binary and intersex elves. In fact, in one of his earliest elven languages, Tolkien even created the word Gregwin to mean hermaphrodite. Evidently, Tolkien did imagine intersex elves and deliberately included them in his language, eschewing with a biological sexual binary. This gender-body divide is also present in the Ainur. They are essentially bodiless, although they can take on a physical form if they choose, and they have an innate internal sense of gender. If they take on a body, then they take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female, for that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice. Thus, in the very opening pages of the Ainur Lindale, the essentialist idea that body determines gender is rejected. Furthermore, the Ainur can take on any shape that they like or no shape at all, and are not bound by any sexual binary. For example, the Vala Yavanna at times takes on the form of a woman, but at times she takes other shapes. Some there are who have seen her standing like a tree under heaven, crowned with the sun, and from all its branches there spilled a golden dew. So there is endless possibility of Ainur whose temper is non-binary or fluid, and as with elves, this separation of gender from biology leaves open those possibilities. The Ainur's innate ability to change their bodies at will to align with their current temperament can also be read as sympathetic to gender transition. Like the elves and dwarves, hobbits are ambiguously gendered. They have high voices and beardless faces, and they're small. The adults appear as children, and they possess the androgyny of children. And of course, any discussion of gender nonconformity in Tolkien would be incomplete without mention of Éowyn. The Witch King says that no living man can hinder him, and he is killed by Éowyn and Merry, neither one a man. When Pippin is called a man, he indignantly says, "Man, indeed not, I am a hobbit." So here we have two different ideas of what it means to be a man, species and gender. Éowyn and Merry might each call the other a man, but neither would identify as such. The Rohirrim want to leave behind everyone not man, but it is specifically the not men, maybe men, depending on definition men, who defeat the Lord of the Nazgul. There are those who read Éowyn's arc as reinforcing ideas of gender, arguing that when she falls in love with Faramir, she begins to fully return to her true nature as a woman. The references to healing and growing show that she has embraced the womanly role assigned for her. But I would argue that almost all of the Lord of the Rings heroes choose a life of healing and growing. Sam travels the Shire planting trees. Aragorn comes into his kingship not on the battlefield, but in the houses of healing, and claims it by planting a tree. And Éowyn goes to Ithilien with Faramir, who does not love the sword for its brightness. Oh, sorry, I completely messed up that quote. The bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory, but only that which they defend. And it is he who suggests that together they dwell in fair Ithilien and there make a garden. Within Tolkien's world, these are not attributes that signify a womanly role. That Éowyn is happy to exist as a woman when she finds a place where that can be a gift rather than a cage does not detract from the fact that her journey is very much one of challenging essentialist ideas of what a woman is, what a man is, and what they both can and cannot do. Thus, Tolkien's world is filled with queer relationships and characters, as well as a complicated approach to gender and sex that leaves space for transgender, non-binary, and intersex characters. What we might read as gender nonconformity is in many ways normative in Middle-earth, and relationships that we might call non-normative are integral to the redemption of the world. Certainly, Frodo and Boromir and Sauron and others represent non-normative sexuality and gender in ways that can be read as negative. And there is a fair degree of compulsory hetero-amatonormativity brought in at the end of The Lord of the Rings. But there are also plenty of cis-heteronormative villains, and even Sauron's queer relationships are complex. His time in Eregion is the closest he comes to redemption, and his ability to admire Melkor is described as a shadow of good within him. So while on the surface, Tolkien's fiction can reinforce gender norms and compulsory heteroamatonormativity, beneath the surface, it in fact destabilizes both. In Arda, Tolkien has envisioned a world with a wide range of diverse gender, sexual, familial categories. And as the gaffer would say, that's being queer. And we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts. Thank you.
There we go. Danna, that was spellbinding. So much information you've been able to pack into just a 20-minute paper. Thank you very, very much for coming to talk to us about this today. And you just look at the chat and the volume of interest in the topics that you've been covering. I think your paper has blown people's minds. So thank you very, very much. Now we are going to jump into some questions. So let's get started. Okay, so question number one. What do you think? Oh, wait, let's make sure I'm on the right. Don't want to ask you a question for the last paper. Would you say that amatonormativity in works like Lord of the Rings can feed the seed of real-world issues like gay marriage by influencing the decisions of, say, lawmakers? And if so, what do you think fiction authors can do to help nudge readers in the direction of chucking harmful and intolerant positions?
I definitely do think that art, that life mirrors art as much as the opposite. I think that we definitely see and have seen throughout history responses, like widespread societal responses to works of fiction that can influence government policies, although it's a slow process. I would say that what writers and all artists really need to do is focus on how their readers are going to view their content. Trying to deliberately, specifically influence politicians to change the law, I think, leads towards allegory and fiction that might just be a little bit too to the point, whereas works like Lord of the Rings that just have this very, very rich world with all these different kinds of characters and relationships that's going to sink into readers without hitting them over the head with it, which is not to say that allegory and pointed literature can't be very effective, but in terms of influencing a more widespread response that could shift social mores, I think that building it into the world like Tolkien does, rather than having specific token characters to make a proven point, would be more effective.
Wonderful, thank you. Our second question. Yes, okay, so how do you feel that the concept, oh, have I missed? Yes, we'll go with this. How do you feel that the conception of these close non-sexual love between people of the same sex compares to similar close male friendships / relationships in medieval and classical models familiar to Tolkien, or incomparable contemporaries?
Well, for one thing, I think that we have to be careful saying non-sexual love because we don't know. Tolkien does not ever describe sex and rarely mentions it. These characters could have been having sex, they could not have been. We can't know that, and we can't really talk about it explicitly. As for how it relates to depictions of relationships that are not necessarily sexual, I think absolutely Tolkien was very clearly influenced by the medieval stories, the Arthurian legends that represent male friendship in a way that doesn't have to be sexual, in a way that can be tender and emotional and divine in all sorts of ways. And the sexual aspect seems almost to fall by the wayside, which is not to say that it's not very important for contemporary readers to think about that aspect. But I think that those stories that Tolkien was drawing from definitely gave him a model of male relationships very different from what we frequently see in fiction, where, and in real life, where men are not really allowed to express emotions and tenderness.
Wonderful, thank you. Our third question, how does Shelob fit into your reading of gender? The only names of giant spiders we meet are, of course, female.
Right. A lot of the scholarship about Shelob and gender reads through a Freudian lens. I do not have time right now to go on a rant about how we need to leave Freud's views of gender and sexuality and women back in the 1920s where they belong. But I do think it's interesting that these monster figures are female, Shelob and Ungoliant, the other giant spider. The dragons are male, the Balrogs are male when they're gendered, but the spiders are female. There are very clear depictions of the monstrous feminine associated with motherhood, but again, in a monstrous way as they eat their mates and spawn. I think there are lots of literary parallels. One would be Sin from Paradise Lost, and thinking that the descriptions of Shelob's body echo that sort of classic monstrous female. But Shelob is more powerful than the monstrous female often is allowed to be. She's wounded by Sam, but not killed. And while Sauron, being the person he is, thinks of her as a pet, we're told very clearly that he does not rule her. She was there before him. And she has this odd relationship with Gollum, where she suffers him to pass. She accepts homage from him. He bows down before her and brings her sacrifice, and she accepts this. There is intelligence in Shelob that is greater than a lot of monstrous female characters and a lot of the other monsters that our narrators encounter. Ungoliant is also extremely powerful. She overcomes Melkor, who is supposed to be the mightiest of the Valar. She eats the sun and the moon. Okay, the trees that represent the sun and the moon, but it's an extremely powerful image. I would honestly say that these giant spiders are excellent additions to the overall depiction of female characters. There are so many male monsters. It's good to see some equal opportunity monstrosity, and they round out to a degree the largely idealized depictions of women in Tolkien.